Hi, everyone. Thank you. And thank you so much for coming tonight for our Emerging Writers series. The Committee on Creative Writing is very happy to welcome Miley to the university as our 2011 Emerging Writer in Fiction, and also Katie Rossing, who will be reading alongside her. But well, it's going to be a kind of a cascading introduction here where I'm going to tell you a little bit about Miley, and then Miley's going to come up and tell you a little bit about Katie, and then Katie will read, and then Miley will read, and then we can ask questions if we have time and something like that, okay? So a little bit about Miley for you guys. Miley received her MFA from Syracuse University and her PhD in Literature and Creative Writing from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where she was a Schaefer Fellow in Fiction and is soon to be a professor of creative writing. At the moment, though, along with being the fiction editor at Witness magazine, Miley is a fellow at the New York Public Library's Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, which is really a wonderful honor and a really ridiculous gig because you get an office at the New York Public Library, 9 months of writing, big wad of cash. So it's like perfect for a writer, right? But most recently, Miley's first novel, Your Presence, is requested at Suvanto, which she spent 7 years writing? 7 years writing, guys, for those of you who are languishing in your first year, okay? She spent 8 years writing it, the first year in Finland as a Fulbright Fellow, and along with garnering wonderful reviews, Miley's novel was also recently nominated for the prestigious Guardian First Book Award. And I'm especially happy to have Miley here because I count her among my good friends. We got to know each other well in Las Vegas, and I'm so proud of her recent success. In The Guardian, Lucy Ellman describes Your Presence is requested at Suvanto as a gem. Vivid and weird, its intricacies are sophisticated, its stance beguiling and complex. And I would agree, and I also would describe Miley in exactly the same way. And I know that along with being tremendously smart and talented and disciplined, Miley also possesses two qualities I think that a lot of great writers have. One is a deep empathy for other people, and two, a deep curiosity for all the ways that people are incidentally, inevitably, and willfully sick. Read her book, you'll see what I mean. It's a very, very good, interesting book. So please help me welcome Maile Chapman.
And now in a minute, please help me welcome Katie Rossing. I'm going to say a few words about why I chose Katie to read here tonight with me based on an excerpt from her final project. And part of why I chose Katie's work, Katie through her work, is because there's a wonderful confidence in it. And when I was working on my book, I was thinking a lot about architecture and a lot about voice and a lot about place and about different ways in which to put those things together so that one can create a place that's more than just a setting, but that's actually, a real active part of a story, a real presence in the narrative, a real felt environment. And that's hard to do, and especially doing it through shifting voices is doubly hard because you're creating multiple personas that each have a grasp on a world which is itself very complex and concrete. So it's quite a project, and the confidence in Katie's voices in the excerpt that I read really caught me in that way. And I also tend to admire works of fiction that combine a sort of non-fictional authority in the voice, and I felt that her writing displayed that really nicely. And there was an image in particular, not spoiler alert, sort of, not really, just a small image that captures and describes this. There's a moment in the excerpt that I read when a big slab of concrete is sort of willfully imposed on a raw environment. in a swamp, and there is this possibility that it will be marked by delicate little marks from other creatures, and that's just such a beautiful way of thinking about the way that place and man's willingness or ambitions to impose himself on place play out in her work. That I look forward to hearing it, and I'm sure you all will too. And so, please, be welcome. You're
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. It's really great. I'm going to read from my BA project, which is a short story, and it's set in New Orleans, Louisiana. It's about a swamp. So, it's titled The Dixie Agony of O.O. LeBreau. When the blizzard hit New Orleans, the old voodoo-dabbling midnight disc jockey on WBEZ called the end of the world. Holy Mother Queen Mary Laveau, Christy Almighty Daddy Hell, he said, snowflakes melting in his hair. Even in the moment of crisis, he scrupulously delimited his vocabulary according to his idea of FCC sanctions. Maybe a bit paranoid. It's the day of reckoning. I'm calling it. Time to show our hands. The DJ was quiet. Dead air dragged on. I've lived in New Orleans for 68 years and never seen nothing like this. Finger of God, he said. Finger of God reaching down and swirling us up. You know what that means. I'm calling it. He popped Rebirth's Here to Stay in the record slot and shot himself through the heart with a .44 Remington Magnum. The blizzard could only be accounted for as an act of singular supernatural intervention. As such, it sat just beyond the fingertips of rational inquiry, the kind of phenomenon that seems downright silly to try to bind up in the ropes of reasonableness. One of those things you just kind of look at and say something like shucks and move on because there's this sincere feeling that that's all you can do. Sit down, eat your peas, and accept that there are things in this world that haunt, nibbling at the darkest edges of science. That was this blizzard. For most people, but not for everyone. Because if the curious tale that unfolds from the contents of this fire-toasted manila folder is to be believed, the blizzard might have had a genuine traceable causality, a totally rational raison d'etre. But that raison might seem just as strange, if not stranger, than the darkest edges of science throw your hands up approach. It's one of those calls that nobody's gonna make for you, least of all me. One of those times where you gotta throw out the jack because no one else is gonna draw the line in the sand. So, the blizzard pounced on New Orleans overnight in November 1998. Thousands of tons of snowflakes startling the city into a strange dark silence. The neon signs of Bourbon Street kept right on buzzing, but there was no one there. The dancing girls had all gone home. Bartenders turned off the music. Only the slow, quiet old drunks lingered on their stools. Only one act of violence punctuated the peaceful quietude, a small, deadly incident of arson. The fire trucks were stuck, their tires whizzing into snowdrifts. Their sirens wailed pitifully, like the baleful moans of a brontosaurus stuck and sinking into a pit of tar. Hours later, when the snow had dampened the flames and the fire trucks had been rescued by the National Guard, firefighters began to sift through the charred remains of the Skinny Shotgun house. The first thing they found was the body of Lenore A. Child, a 29-year-old freelance journalist whose penchant for lime-flavored beer and frilly underwear belied her heart of gold and the attitude of serious rigor with which she approached her investigative reporting. Neighbors told police that she told them that she had been on a special assignment for the Tabasco Corporation, maybe digging into the history of one of the McElhaney boys, but nobody knew exactly what she was uncovering with her research. Kept a real tight lip, one of her neighbors remarked to a Times-Picayune reporter who had trudged through the thigh-deep snow to interview witnesses at the scene. Nice girl, though. The only documentation salvaged from the fire's wreckage was a charred manila folder full of documents and notes. It might not tell the whole story of the great New Orleans blizzard of 1998, but it does contain a fascinating and curious tale, one that hints at the kind of cosmic fucking around that was going on at about the time the mythic blizzard hit. This also, maybe, explains Lenore Child's murder. She just might have been on the verge of uncovering the Tabasco Corporation's involvement in one of the most malicious eco-terrorism schemes ever conceived, a plot to eradicate Louisiana's Barataria swamp. So the next section that I'm going to read is actually from a document from the file that Lenore has been compiling. So this is a letter from O.O. Lebreau to the Committee on Corporate Campus Planning of the Tabasco Corporation, written in March of 1970. Dear Sirs, please find enclosed my project team's proposal for the Tabasco Corporate Campus Open Architectural Bid. I trust the following essay should suffice as a brief treatment of its philosophical, contextual, and practical design goals, giving some heft to the phantasmal blueprints I've enclosed within, a little blood to run in their cold white veins. Picture yourself in a Louisiana swamp. The Barataria, for example, a mere half-hour drive from the city of New Orleans, yet in spirit more remote to civilization than Crusoe's island. Step 1 foot inside the Barataria and you face a hot, hissing jumble of death. This kind of mess is an avowed enemy to commercial progress, gentlemen, and you hold in your hands my proposal, a way to plug the swamp's entropic drain. Look around. This place is vile and hungry, its tail gnawed on by its own green teeth. Listen. All human thought is drowned out by the bellow of rude cicadas and the hostile zing of fat mosquitoes. And watch your step. True to its guileful nature, much of the swamp ground is fake. Thick algae blankets and reeds will betray you, disguising the alligator-ridden water as land. This deceit is, in fact, one of the evil reptile's allies in its steady diet of mammal flesh. Yes, the Barataria is a dark cannibal of a place. It bears not a single muddy footprint of humanity. To survive here is to live in a constant state of mortal paranoia. Peripatetic black eyes of alligators glint in the murk, palmetto leaves mask a carpet of bloodthirsty insects, and armies of ants sweep in waves across giant grasshoppers, their tiny bodies slipping through the fissures in the grasshoppers' body walls and eating them from the inside out. The utter banality of evil indeed. This wild mess is a thoroughly inauspicious place for human beings, yet a handful have staked out their lives there, propping their houses up on cypress stilts and getting used to the stink of rot between their toes. The longer they spend there, the more they forget of their humanity. The place perverts them. They strike a bargain with their environment, and in exchange for their survival, they let the swamp infect a little chunk of their souls with its damp nihilism. It inhales humanity like lines of cocaine, a gobbling addiction to our very souls. I ask you, gentlemen, how can we consciously coexist with such a place? How can we bear to coexist with such a dark and malevolent blot, a vacuum, a mortal danger, the seeds of a gangrenous tide that threatens to infect the body whole, and a mere 30-minute drive from the city of New Orleans? The answer, we cannot. Gentlemen, I write to convince you that Louisiana can change. We can change it. Man will take a stand. Now is the hour. I have the plan. That's the end of the Lebreau letter. And the next document included is a magazine clipping. It's titled Postcard from the South, an interview with architect O.O. Lebreau. It's published in the 1971 July edition of The New Yorker. It's written by Kelvin Kittwater. Mr. Lebreau stands just over 5 feet tall, with snow-white skin and an ultra-thin patch of wispy hair, the boyish color of corn silk, that sits beret-like atop his oblong skull. He affects a tensioned intensity in his posture, like his limbs are made from live wires. In fact, he barely sits at our sidewalk cafe table at Café du Monde, seeming to hover half an inch above the seat of his chair. He orders from the waitress with a crisp efficiency, un café noir, and turns his chilly gaze towards me. Beneath his cliché black frame architect glasses, the whites of his eyes have a bluish pallor, like 2 small chunks of iceberg that have been stuck to his face. That's the end of the excerpt. And the next is another magazine clipping. It was published in the 1996 November issue of Archigram. It's titled Exclusive, A Life, Legacy, and Demise, 25 years after O.O. Lebreau's splash into Southern architecture, Archigram revisits the sordid tale behind the world's most famous swampicidal architect. Back in 1972, Archigram reporter Lucinda Wu had no idea what she was in for when she went on assignment to profile the mysterious O.O. Lebreau, just 27 years old and already famous for his first building, the Tabasco Bird. She might have gotten an inkling when the pale-faced little man opened his mouth. A century of human subjugation in the face of this ferocious swampland has come screeching to a stop, right at the threshold of this very doorsill where you are standing. LeBreau spoke with frightening conviction. The young architect looked Wu in the eye with a spine-chilling intensity that she claimed caused spontaneous shivers for months afterward. "You are standing," he continued, "right at this moment, at the literal threshold of humanity." Such was the language hissing like hellfire from the trembling young lips of that evangelical architect, just flirting with the cusp of fame in 1972. This strange young man had a vision upon which he was willing to stake his entire life and professional reputation. That vision would come to be, of course, the sole known case of time-released architectonic eco-terrorism, the cantankerous, concrete Tabasco Center, better known as the Bird for its likeness to a common crudity. Full credit for the brutalist-inspired stunner goes to that uptight and over-anxious Creole architect. Today, right here in the middle of Louisiana's once-thought incorrigible Barataria swamp, mankind has taken a stand, he told Wu in 1972. A stand in the war on nature. And I have one more document to share with you from Lenore's file, and it's another magazine clipping. It's from 1996, and it is called On the Lam for a Quarter Century, 25, it's another excerpt from the one of the previous articles that I read. Okay. From a young age, the bird drew all of LeBreau's energy, fixed like an albatross in his mind. In that early interview with Archigram in October 1972, LeBreau recalled his childhood as a long, bleak hallway of total obscurity, lit at one distant end like some quasi-sacred Flavin installation by this image, this sacred glowing blueprint, the blueprint, weighing on me like the directive of a fiery Old Testament God. Build me, build me. Ever since its completion in 1972, the bird has remained the sole enduring symbol of human presence in the Barataria swamp, a wet swath of land on the southern edge of Louisiana that was long considered unbuildable. LeBreau's innovation was in the building's foundation, which was a massive floating slab of reinforced concrete. The cement was a specially developed blend designed to stand a chance against the brackish, rising and falling water table while supporting the immense gravitational pressure of a vertically inclined black marble palace. The huge slab was poured in the middle of the watery Barataria and took 2 long years to pour and dry. Progress was slow, marred by innumerable problems ranging from workers' heat exhaustion to the endless task of replaning whenever a creature of the swamp would drop from the adjacent cypress trees and scurry across the still wet cement. The contractor grudgingly resorted to hauling out massive hot air blowing devices to the site. The fiscal pain was alleviated slightly by Revlon Cosmetics, which subsidized the cost of the devices in exchange for the right to plaster them with slogans reading, "World's largest hairdryer," setting the stage for many amusing, whimsical photo ops that delighted the company's PR firm and even made it onto the editorial page of the December 1972 French edition of Vogue. The shrill whine of environmentalists, newly indignant from the recent publication of Silent Spring, was nothing more than a passing irritation for LeBreau. He brushed them aside like gnats. Although brushed aside might be a bit of a misnomer, the brushing was in fact a brutal act more akin to bulldozing, akin being yet another mealy-mouthed misrepresentation. In fact, let's just come right out and say it, LeBreau negotiated with an unscrupulous contractor to straight-up bulldoze the cypress trees in which the innocent young activists slept. Their sudden disappearance was blamed on alligators. Once complete, the slab became the largest concrete structure in the history of the planet. Thank you.
That was great. All right. So I'm going to be reading an excerpt from something that is probably climatically, culturally, temperamentally the opposite. Very, very cold, where Katie's is very, very warm. Set in Finland in the middle 20th century, indeterminate time. The novel takes place in a fictional hospital. It's a surgical hospital, a regional hospital in Finland, in southwestern Finland, in a bilingual region, which maintains, by bilingual I mean Finnish and Swedish speaking, but on top of that, there's one English-speaking ward, which is subsidized by a timber company, jointly owned by American and Finnish enterprises. So it is an environment to which American wives are attracted during especially the winter, long cold winter months in Finland. If they are stationed with their husbands in outlying timber towns, the pressure of trying to assimilate, of trying to learn very difficult language of Finnish, of trying to adjust to the climate alone and the really short hours of daylight prove too much sometimes. And it is a little easier to be sick, even if one is a hypochondriac, and to go and to be among other English speakers. And so the circumstance of the hospital is that it's a functioning surgical hospital with this one ward that is full of people who treat it sort of like a rest cure slash spa slash hotel, in which they can avoid the pressures of their real lives in the winter. And into that environment comes a doctor who actually wants those beds to be used for a good or better purpose. He is working on a surgical stitch to be used in cesarean sections, and has come to Finland to do this research because he has a family connection to the timber company. And so I wanted to read just a little bit about the hospital grounds on the subject of architectural planning, community planning, and or lack thereof. So the doctor's name is Peter Weber. William is his brother, who works for the timber concern, and Kusti is the facilities engineer at the hospital. So the Dr. Webers arrive in September, just a few weeks before the sticking snows that will come this year in the dirty month of Lokaku, or October, which is too bad, but not serious, because they've come in permanence and will see the summer next year, presumably. He has been here already before, Dr. Peter Weber. He's had previous thoughts of joining the staff, of bringing Mrs. Dr. Peter and the children into the community, if it seemed a good opportunity for him, in the specific outline of his larger plan. The years are quickly passing and full of change, and Dr. Peter can do things now that would not have been possible a decade ago. He has more or less perfected the idea of a new type of uterine stitch, for example, one that uses catgut on the inside, silk on the outside, and that will save the lives of many women, many mothers, after cesarean sections. William Weber is the connection, of course, and the reason Peter comes to Finland now, for research and practice in a quiet place. The stitch will be named for them both, a Weber stitch. It will be a good thing. He is confident of this. They have been given the second doctor's villa, a pine house behind a dense black thicket that tumbles in a long dark line along the grassy slope toward the path. It is a calm house with a long rectilinear face and 2 round dormer windows closely set into the hipped roof between 4 square dark chimneys, and below a deeply sheltered porch. The patients do not come this close to the house, not legitimately. It is a relatively private property, off limits, unfortunately, for those who are curious about how authority lives in private, and who among us isn't. When the doctors are away inside the clinical wing during the day, it doesn't hurt to try for a glimpse of that other daytime life, the one unspooled by their wives, their children, the life that ticks along parallel to ours, yet awfully different. Their premises are separated from the hospital complex by a modest wooden fence and gate that is left unlocked, at least in the beginning. But its presence is a gentle reminder to us to observe the separation, to turn aside when strolling. The gate is on one of 2 paths connecting the doctor villas and the row of junior doctor houses to the hospital proper, a path that winds through the trees and more dividing, screening thickets, and is the route the doctors' wives might take if they're coming down for some special event like a Christmas party or something with a similar charitable feeling. There is another way, a second way, evidence of discreet convenience, a covered walkway with a pitched roof leading from the villas on their subtly higher ground. This walkway terminates at the private, sheltered rear entrance of the clinical wing, which is locked in the evenings and for which each physician carries a key. This walkway can only be taken to and from the private clinic door, and if you cannot find the private door, then you cannot find the second path to the villas. There's no other way of access unless by climbing up a ravine through dead leaves and sharp broken stones, by taking hold of the wooden handrail and heaving oneself over. But why would anyone ever do that? If one was bent on getting to the villas, one would naturally take the obvious path toward the politely unlocked obstacle of the gate and the gentle climb up and around the bend. Continuing hierarchy, more subtle here than elsewhere because it is suggested by the natural landscape. The first Doctor Villa, which is the house of the medical superintendent, is the highest on the residential hill, though all of the residences are situated with pleasing prospects. Limey and the other staff architects of the company did what seemed natural to them, and no resident need now look directly down into another's windows. The goal in the Finnish forests is to never see a neighbor's house except by intention, and the trees and thickets make this possible. The bedrooms are generally placed with windows to the southeast, the pantries to the north to borrow cold, and one might at most see a bit of kitchen window glinting on a sunny day. Maybe, if one was walking near enough, Mrs. Dr. Peter there decanting boiled drinking water to remove the minerals before making Dr. Peter and herself a cup of coffee. And maybe this scene, the arm lifting, the pitcher of water, is only visible because of recent changes, because the original hedge would have given better privacy, as well as serving the second purpose of reducing wind problems on that side of the house. But Dr. Peter, newly arrived now and happy in the autumnal sun, having only visited in summer and speculating about the darker months to come, has insisted that Kusti tear out some of the hedge. Mrs. Dr. Ruotsalainen in the villa above purposely does not look down as Dr. Peter blights the layout. Dr. Ruotsalainen agrees. He is partially deaf now, but so well grounded that he pulls unspoken words out of the air quite easily. And so that evening he steps outside and he lights his pipe. Without looking, he sees that Kusti's workers, gone for the day, have left behind a raw hole and a pile of splintered roots dug out of the soil. He knows that he can see Dr. Peter through the window, drinking his coffee, and so he stands and he stares the other way and he smokes until Dr. Peter feels obliged to look at him. And then Dr. Ruotsalainen turns further away and looks out in another direction, offering only the side of his head. And this seems somehow aggressive to Dr. Peter, at odds with the apparent shyness he has been told to expect from his Finnish colleagues. He stands and waits for his chance to nod in greeting, but still Dr. Ruotsalainen stares off into the distance and smokes, and although he looks neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, he will not go away, so that Dr. Peter finally steps outside also, wanting to be polite, but also wanting to find out what's happening. He has a lot to do in the next few weeks, and he hopes he won't have to respond to this kind of thing very often, this feeling of having stepped on toes without realizing. Not that he has a problem with getting along, but getting along with his colleagues isn't why he's here, and he'd rather not spend too much time trying. It's very private here, Dr. Ruotsalainen says quietly. He points with the stem of his pipe at the trees and then puts it back in his mouth, but not stupidly so, not that way at all. We're trying to capitalize on the sunlight, says Dr. Peter, though Dr. Ruotsalainen certainly can't hear him at that range. The next day, the work is halted. Kusti's workers, working slowly, expecting to be intervened upon, will now have just the one patch of a hedge to replace. But winter is coming, and the replacement corner of the hedge will fail to thrive once it is replanted, and the leaves will wither and hang so that the corner continues to impose itself. Voi jumalauta, says Mrs. Dr. Ruotsalainen privately. God Almighty, what a fool. The Peters will hear the wind picking at the side of the house in consequence, and can also see, from one corner, the gate, and occasional patients walking along the path, pausing and looking up at them, or sometimes lingering in the trees, as if hiding. So the situation is that these ambulatory patients, who are mostly American, but from other English-speaking locations as well, or from other places, for which English becomes the lingua franca between all of them, walk a lot and are pretty mobile, and they spend a lot of time on the grounds. It's fairly remote. It is near a beach. And those who come from elsewhere have a hard time adjusting, especially when winter starts coming. It's cold, it's dark, the snow gives this feeling of being isolated and snowed in, even if it's not literally true. But also adjusting to different routines, physically and emotionally, doesn't come easily to them, including Dr. Peter. And the other main American character, the main character of the novel, is a nurse named Sunny, who comes to work in Finland, having worked at home looking after her mother during a terminal illness. And her objective has just been to get away, just someplace quiet, and that's enough for now. So she's in this paradoxical situation where she is an English speaker and she spends her time with the wives, the timber wives, She's trying to learn Finnish. Finnish is notoriously difficult, something of a difficult culture to penetrate if you're living rurally and you don't speak the language. So she doesn't really have people other than this group of probably hypochondriacal, possibly spoiled women who are of a completely different class than she is. So she's in a bit of a bind, and she tries to maintain her professionalism while still finding a way to have some kind of life here. Other characters for this excerpt are a woman named Julia, who is actually Danish, and she comes to join the Timberwives because in Dr. Peter's plans for perfecting the stitch, he wants people to stay who are, viable surgical candidates. He's not a bad person. His goals are actually, really quite positive and quite beneficial. And if anybody doesn't want to stay, that is fine. And if they do want to stay, they are probably sick enough to warrant, medical attention. It is, after all, a hospital. So Julia comes to be seen by him. The other English-speaking up patient is Mrs. Minder, who's an American timber wife. And Mrs. Minder has a few behavioral kinks. And Julia is not a very nice woman herself. So it is Saturday afternoon, and Sunny takes her bicycle out onto the paths, as she normally does, heading away from the building for the sake of air and exercise. She slows down to cross one of the service lanes, looking both ways for safety. The trees are thinner here, affronted maybe by the passing of occasional delivery trucks. The scant sunlight has starved the lower branches, and she can tell that there are clearings nearby, open spots that have been cut and maintained. She can hear someone chopping wood close at hand in one of them. There's a quick flash of color down the lane as she passes, scarcely seen, unexpected, though normal enough. People work down there, and it must be awful work. She won't ride that way. The lane passes through the outbuildings, too near the clinging, bilious atmosphere of the pig barn and its stink of liquid excrement that not even the pines can filter from the air. But Sunny rarely sees anyone on foot this far from the yard. She stops, backs up. The coat and hat had been red. "Mrs. Minder," Sunny calls, and gets no answer. She rides on, but it troubles, and in a few minutes she turns back. The sound of chopping from the clearing has ceased, and she hears nothing when she pauses except boughs moving, brushing together. She pushes her bicycle down the lane, her face pinched in preparation for the smell, but there's nothing, only wood smoke, which makes her pause again. In such quiet, the sounds of fire stand out, hissing as from greenish wood, and the smoke grows stronger as she walks. Sunny props her bike against a tree and steps into the shade onto a footpath, walking suspiciously over the soft needles. The clearing is unexpectedly close, and immediately she sees not Mrs. Minder, but Julia, with her back to the lane, her cane in one gloved hand and the other steadied against the rough bark of the nearest tree. She's looking out into the clearing, where there is a traditional log smokehouse, its door standing open, and a man working alone, keeping warm beside an outdoor fire. He wears the same kind of sturdy blue coverall that Kusti wears, but with a full apron tied over, and this is spotted because he's busy cutting meat on a makeshift board and sawhorse table. A pig, and particularly a sow, and particularly one watched from behind while it walks, is burlesque in the way of a zoftig and very naked lady, because of the rump, of course, and also because of the way that the thighs touch, mincing on hooves that are not unlike small, fancy shoes. There's also, similarly, the striking approximation of a human smile on the face of every pig, even a slaughtered one, hung upside down by the hocks. The small eyes close tight in mirth, and the mouth hangs open in a pleasant expression, made worse by the color of the face, which, in its pallor, approximates the color of Nordic human flesh. The cold carcass of such a pig hangs upside down from an iron frame beside the man's table, already bled and chilled and emptied of viscera. The man stoops to shift a slab of meat from the table onto his shoulder and takes it into the smokehouse. His eyes pass over the place where Julia stands, but without marking her particularly, It's not the first time she's been there, watching. The fire in the fire pit makes a merry sound, steaming, and another column of smoke rises straight as a string from the chimney. A cat crouches comfortably beside the doorway, watching for the odd scrap of fat, which the man will often toss and the cat neatly consume, leaving only a damp spot behind on the sill. The man comes back out, takes up his hatchet, and slides apart the hooks. He steadies the carcass, one hand in the cavity. As it turns, it reveals repellently familiar wrinkles in the usual places, the back of the pig's neck, under the short hanging arms, and between the upended legs, now spread in an attitude of violence. The man lifts the hatchet and rests it, blade down, just there, moving the tail out of the way for accuracy or delicacy, and with his other hand, he raises a mallet and brings it down hard, making Sonny flinch, though Julia doesn't react. The blade sinks into the rump and stops at bone, and he hits it again, repeatedly, splitting into the pelvis, cutting down through the spine. He pauses to trade his grips, and the body slowly butterflies open. The pig's head and neck are sturdy, but then the back of the skull gives way, and only the fleshy, elongated face remains intact and connected. When the face is sundered, the animal will no longer be an animal. With the last blow, the pig will disappear, and meat will hang instead. He taps gently through the cartilage of the snout, and then the two halves move independently, swinging and bumping haphazardly. In cross-section, the body is surprisingly vivid, all pink and red, and laced with white ribbons and pale chambers like a valentine or a split pomegranate. The head is full of tightly packed stuff, pearly, fresh, the jawbone lean, white, and very long. Buried in the sliced red meat of the cheek is a pattern of something pale. Teeth? The man lifts one of the sides and drops it heavily onto the table to portion out, some to smoke, some to send to the kitchen fresh, and a bucket of scraps for sausage. He tosses something more to the cat, to the same cat that once hung around the back door of the kitchen. It cleans its face, rubbing and rubbing, until the man tosses it another scrap, and the cat breaks off, staring, its belly already full. Julia has been chewing something as she watches. It's candy, and she puts another piece into her mouth, dropping the foil wrapper at her feet among half a dozen others. As she does so, she looks back over her shoulder. "Smoked ham for Christmas," she says. There is sudden laughter, and Sonny sees the red wool coat of Mrs. Minder in the clearing, 100 yards from Julia, but with her back to the trees, her mittens to her mouth, laughing staccato like a bird. The man glances at her and then ignores her until she throws a pine cone into his fire, scattering sparks. He speaks to her severely in Finnish and points the way back to the path, his face serious but unreadable. "He's pointed twice now," says Julia. "I hope he hits her with the hatchet next." Sonny wants to turn and be gone, back to the bike, leaning where she left it, but she feels pinned and perfunctory. "Come away from there, Julia," she says. "No," says Julia. "I'm watching out for Mary Minder." "You're making fun of Mrs. Minder. It isn't very nice." "She's enjoying herself," says Julia. "Did you bring her out here?" "Not really. She followed me. I can't help that." Julia, realizing Mary was behind her, had no doubt purposely changed her path, leading to a place with fire, a place of trouble. If Mary gets burned, it's Mary's own fault, of course, but Julia will have helped. "Maybe you can't help that, but you know better than to come out here," says Sonny. "You shouldn't walk this far from the building." "Why not?" And yes, why not? The outpatients aren't forbidden to walk the grounds. Yet, for a moment, Sonny weighs, with detachment, the difficulties of forcing Julia to go with her. The compelling, the pulling, the kicking probably, and Mrs. Minder crying, no doubt, and for what? Sonny passes a hand over her eyes, confused. She can't locate a reason for even considering doing this. "Well, I hope you aren't here when I check back in an hour," she says, but only because she feels that she must say something. "Or what?" says Julia, amused. Sonny rides away, down the path as first intended. Her time outside in the midday air has been spoiled, though, and part of her attention drifts up from the path again and again. An hour. She has promised herself an hour. She takes the hour. She is at pains to take the full hour. And then she turns back, rides past the lane, sees nothing, hears nothing, rides on, and eventually circles the hospital building, coming to a halt at the front entrance. She parks her bike and steps inside just long enough. to check the book. Julia, Mrs. Minder, both signed in, a few minutes apart. Julia first, even given her slow pace compared to the red-wool darting and rushing of Mary Minder. But then maybe Mary had stayed longer, throwing more cones into the fire, not understanding when she was told to leave, and laughing, probably still laughing, not understanding the cultivation of boundaries, because she has none, so how could she understand that she wasn't welcome? Sunny sees Mrs. Minder in the foyer that evening, and for a moment she is obliged to stand with her among others waiting to enter the dining room. But nothing will come of it. No mention will be made. Because even if Mrs. Minder had been aware of Sunny there, in the smokehouse meadow, she might not really remember, because Mrs. Minder lives in the moment, so close behind the glass of her own eyes that she has no distance to make use of, no perspective from which to contemplate. And so, as in the lives of animals, she just continues in her circles, in her routines, one day vanishing endlessly into the next, without having registered in the first place. "What's for dinner?" Mary Minder says, stretching to see the specials. "Mrs. Minder, you ought to know already, but you don't, and this is proof." Thanks.
We have 15 minutes or so. I mean, does anyone have any questions for Miley? Any questions at all? Dan?
Did you actually see the hog being butchered, or did you just make that up out of whole cloths?
I actually heard a hog being butchered, and didn't look, because it's quite a horrible sound to hear a pig screaming like that. So that experience haunted me, having heard it and not having looked. And it was while I was overseas. I was overseas for 5 years while I worked on this novel. I was in Finland for a year. And it wasn't in Finland that I heard the hog being butchered, but it was for a party. And so there was, it was for a cookout, and I was thinking, I am the only one not having fun with this. And so later I did look up, what it would have looked like. I looked at photos, but I managed to avoid the visuals, mercifully.
And Miley, can you talk a little bit about, you went to Finland for your Fulbright, and you spent a year there, right? And it took you 7 years to write this novel. And I was curious if you can talk a little bit about that. I know there are a lot of writers here who are beginning their novel or have been working on it for a few years. Did you think it would take that long? What was the process like? How did it evolve?
Yeah. It sounds horrible, doesn't it, to work on something that long? If somebody told me that when I started writing it, I probably wouldn't have undertaken it. I did go to Finland. There was a hospital in particular that I wanted to look at. It was a tuberculosis sanitarium designed by Alvar Aalto. It was designed to be built around 1929. And looking at it, it looks like something from, the mid-70s. It was just so modern and easy looking, and so incongruous there in the middle of the pine trees, and so well designed. And that was what made me want to write about functional architecture and the way that people live within it. And so I applied for the Fulbright to go and to be near that building, and nice people showed me everything inside that building and some other hospitals, some other 20th century hospitals. And I spent so much time doing research that the book really changed while I was writing it, because I kept encountering new things, and the things I was encountering were so cool and kind of creepy and better than I could have imagined, that I just kept working on it. One day for my birthday, the year that I was in Finland, this is going to sound a little bizarre, but I really wanted to spend in this hospital, this pediatric hospital that was built in 1940 by a sister and brother team of architects in Helsinki. And when I got there, this is my big birthday treat to myself, to go and poke around this hospital. And the English-speaking guide had a conflict and wasn't there. And so the friend who'd come with me and I spent about 3 or 4 hours, like a long time, in the company of one of the facilities engineers who didn't speak English, who only spoke Finnish. And my Swedish is a lot better than my Finnish, and Finnish is really difficult. And he, bless him, told us so much, and I wrote down as much as I could, and my friend interpreted as much as she could, but we were both studying Finnish at the time, and because of the generosity of people like that, who showed me like creepy boiler rooms and cupboards that were locked inexplicably, and weird.
Boiler rooms are very creepy.
They are super creepy because they're warm and they tick, and can explode, and there's metal, and don't touch things. And although I will say in Finland they were all very clean. They weren't,
They're not in Chicago.
yeah, these were sparkling. And very functional. And so I just kept working on it. But I was writing short stories at the same time. So that's what I would say. If you're writing on a novel and you think it's going to take a while, rather than pushing it to finish, I mean, it's not good to linger, but rather than pushing it to finish before it's ready to be finished, write stories. Because then you at least get the satisfaction of interacting with the outside world when you send them out. Because otherwise you don't talk to anybody for a long period of time about what you're working on, and that's a drag. But yeah, I worked on it for quite a while. But it took me that long to feel confident about a lot of the medical and nursing details. It takes place mostly among the nurses and patients, and so I wanted to. I know a number of nurses, and my aunt is a retired nurse, and I knew people would notice if I got things wrong. Not that other people would be reading it, but those people who I know who are obliged to read it because they're related to me and who are retired nurses would at least tell me that. So to avoid the shame of that, I did a lot of research. Yeah.
Speaking of boiling.
I know, it's creeping me out that I can't see what's making that sound back there.
Anyone have questions?
Yes.
Guess.
Was there something about Finland itself, the culture, the land that spoke to you that made you want to set the novel there, or was it the hospital itself?
Yeah, both, because the hospital is such an example of Finnish design principles, and those principles were so much in evidence in the country and in other examples of design and architecture from Finland, especially around that era, that I wanted to go for all of those reasons, and it also really kind of fits in with the whole aesthetic idea of things being austere and functional and load-bearing, and that was the way that I wanted to construct the novel. I relied a lot on the structure of like classical drama to put it together and to make sure that things were weight-bearing and not just kind of extraneous. And because that's so much the way that things are over there, from people's homes to public interactions, it's a very friendly place, but it's a very quiet place. It's a very culturally quiet place. It's a quiet public culture, and people were wonderful to me, but I had to go out to meet it and to find things, and that combination of functionality and beauty was something that's just so Finnish. The use of natural materials, of stone and of wood, it's just entrancing. Things that are so beautiful. I showed some slides of some of the buildings that I looked at. Another building that I went and poked around. It's amazing. If you tell people you're a writer and you're writing about their thing, whatever their thing is, oftentimes people are so delighted that someone cares. That, and they know about this thing and they care about it, that they'll show you because you're interested, and it's to everybody's advantage. So I went to a fire station that was also was designed by a woman. I was looking at architecture designed, functional buildings designed by women, of which Finland has many, because women started graduating with architectural degrees there like 1898. Some of them were trained in St. Petersburg, polytechnical schools. I mean, it's quite early. And they had the vote really early too, women did. So I went to this fire station, and firefighter number 48, who was on call, spent, again, a couple of hours showing my friend and I everything. He let us sit in the fire truck, and we were like, is there a pole? We have poles at home. Do you have things like that? And he just showed us all of these beautiful things. It's the inside of a fire station. Nobody's ever going to see this. And again, it was, designed in the 30s and 40s. Beautiful. So I was showing some slides of these at a library in Berkeley last year, and somebody in the audience was looking, and he said, "Those are such difficult." He was a master carpenter. He said, "Those are such difficult angles to do in woodworking. And what is that?" And I was like, "That's the stairway. That's the staff stairway in the fire station." It's just beautiful.
Actually, you said something. I was curious about why you chose this landscape and this environment to write what is basically very much a book about women, and this very hermetically sealed, place that many of them chose to stay. And if you could talk a little bit about that and some other books that about women that you kind of chose as models.
I started this for purely practical reasons. My thesis at Syracuse, my MFA thesis was short stories, and I always thought I'm a short story writer. And but when I turn 30, I'm going to start working on a novel. That's what I told myself. And so I finished my thesis, and I was still, I was revising it. I was going into my last year, and I suddenly had this horrible vision of what the next year was going to be like, of me not being in the MFA program anymore, and of finishing my thesis, that nobody was banging down my door to get it, And so here's my finished collection of short stories, and what do I do now, And so I said, okay, I'm going to start the novel now, so that I won't have that lag time, that awful post, graduation slump that can happen if you don't have a project in mind.
Writing in the cold.
Writing in the cold. So I was in Syracuse, and it was freezing. It was, snowdrifts up to my waist practically, because it was January 2001 when I started. Yeah, January 2001 when I started writing this. So it was freezing, and I was pretty much snowed into my building, and a bunch of other writers from the program lived in my building as well. So we were snowed in, and so this idea of the snowed-in environment where people kind of come and go in the hallways and choose not to leave. And I had a lot of architecture books and a lot of nursing books. I was already writing about medicine and architecture, and they just came together, that idea of claustrophobia, architecture, and medicine. And women's medicine is just so much creepier than men's medicine, really. So for writing what's essentially a Gothic novel, that was why it ended up being about, because some of the old nursing texts I had, boy, nightmarish.
There's some of that in this book.
Yeah. Anybody know what a pessary is? Mercifully not.
Yeah, describe what that is.
A pessary is something we're lucky we don't know about. It's a device that is worn to correct a falling uterus. So it's ranges from being a small thing to being a large thing that attaches to something that you wear around your waist, kind of like a piece of tractor equipment. So instead of having surgery to hold your organs in place, you would wear a thing, half of it inside and half of it outside. And that's what you did. You wore that for ever. The things that people lived with, that was what got me writing about history of medicine, even 20th century medicine. Things that now, something happens. The project I'm working on right now, one of the things I'm looking at are, contagion and law, and I'm looking at people passing through the hospital at Ellis Island, another really completely cheerful topic. And some of the things that people got checked for, there were two in particular that could get you turned away, and one was an eye infection that was very common, and the other was a skin infection, both of which, were very contagious, and both of which, 2 weeks to clear it up now, shot or a course of antibiotics. I think the skin thing is actually it's actually it's not funny at all, but it's actually a fungus that people catch from mice.
Oh boy.
And now you can get rid of it in 10 days, and then it was months of getting rid of it. So when you see these pictures of people in the Ellis Island Hospital and they're wearing rags tied around their heads, that's what they're getting over, this thing called Favis. And prior to that, people often mistook it for leprosy. So then your life's over. Yeah. No, it's not leprosy, it's a mouse fungus, and you can get rid of it in 5 to 10 days. Or your life can be over because you think that you have leprosy. That kind of just injustice.
Range of interpretation.
Yeah.
Do you have one last question in the back there? Some kind of question in the back?
Oh, I was just wondering, you were talking about sort of the difference in tone for the book. It sounds like there's a lot about languages, so did the Finnish or Swedish languages inform the style that you chose to write with?
Oh, that's a good question. I had already studied Swedish when I went, and that was why part of why I was looking at the bilingual region, but also luckily a lot of his buildings were there. All of his buildings were there. Finnish was so difficult, and I had the Fulbright, which was just wonderful, and the Fulbright grant for writers is fabulous because they support you and turn you loose, and people love to help you, and it's good publicity for the Fulbright program. I mean, as are the others, but writers actually are like, putting it out there in a way that's accessible to people outside of the fields that they're working in. So I recommend it if you have a place you want to go to look into that. And Finnish was so difficult. So I had access to taking classes at any one of 3 universities in this university town that I chose to go to. And I was studying the Finnish, and it was hard. I mean, I've studied other languages, and I was thinking, you study one, and the second is easier, and after that it just gets easier because you know how to learn a language. But Finnish just undid all of my preconceived ideas about, and I picked it up, and I got by, and I did talk to people who didn't speak English, but I felt so isolated. And so once I moved out of living away from the other foreign scholars, it was a really isolated life, and that really informed the isolated tone of the book, that it really became a book about loneliness and a book about being an outsider. And a lot of that was based on the linguistic distance between myself and the culture. So it did. Yeah. So.
Any other questions?
So that's sort of interesting to me because the Book of Rings sounds a lot like the Magic Mountain.
Yeah.
Has the people sort of brought this up to you, or it's interesting that the book is about an outsider, where it's like it's also very highly constructed, whereas Magic Mountain is sort of an aloof book that's more about a community rather than an outsider individual. I'm not sure if this is really a question, but I wanted to bring that up because your setting rings really nicely at them on.
Well, thank you for.
I'm wondering, I wasn't sure what question.
No, well, thank you for mentioning them in the same breath. That's really, I did use the Magic Mountain as a model in many ways. I really loved reading that book. I read that book very slowly during my year in Finland, and just the idea of an institutional routine and the way that Hans Castorp, right, he goes to visit, for those of you who haven't read it, he goes to visit his cousin who is in a tuberculosis hospital, and he just gets pulled into the routine, and the next thing you know, he's there. He lives there, and then maybe he does or doesn't have tuberculosis, But so this idea that you go someplace to visit. I mean, you go to a hospital to visit somebody, and you move in, and you may or may not be sick. The thought of a routine having that kind of pull over somebody is really, means that it's as much about health and a striving towards health as it is about treating illness. So there's got to be something appealing about it. And actually, at one point, when it came time to try to, present this it's published, in the States, my agent said, well, if you were going to say to somebody, it's like this and this, how would you locate it for other people? And I said, it's like the Magic Mountain and The Shining. Which...
I'll put Black Narcissus in there. You've seen Black Narcissus?
No.
Alan Pressburger movie. Have you guys? From the 50s and 60s. Gorgeous movie about a bunch of nuns in the Himalayas.
No.
They
Netflix.
get all sexy and weirded out. That's not what you're.
No, there's none of that in this book.
But it's a good accompany. Thank you all for coming very much, and thank you, Katie Ross, for reading.